As you heard, we are going to be recording this conference. That will allow you, as well as anyone else you think might be interested in it, to watch it after the fact. So it will be available on the CentralOKgo website after this conference today. We will be starting the conference here shortly. I'm just allowing a few more people to join in, knowing that right around the noon hour, people can be trying to finish up things at work and trying to get onto the webinar. So just giving people a few minutes, but we will be starting here shortly on the CentralOKgo Commuter Corridor Study webinar number 2. Okay, it looks like we've got several of our participants already joined. So we'll go ahead and get started with webinar number 2 for the CentralOKgo Commuter Corridor Study. Really want to thank all of you all for spending some time with us today. Appreciate it for sure. Just a couple of housekeeping items, if you will. This website will be recorded, and therefore it will be up on our website available after today. So that if you want to replay it again or point someone in the direction of the webinar to watch if you think they might be interested, we would appreciate that, and it'll be on the website. Additionally, we'll also have the slides available on the website. And just so you're also aware, we will be, besides just recording it, we'll also be muting people's phones. And that's just so there's not background noise interference and everyone can hear the presentation as we go through it. We will have you be able to ask questions through the function called Notes. So if you can look at your screen, and on the right-hand side at the top, typically, you'll see a Participants tab, and then you'll see a Notes tab. So under the Notes tab, there is a drop-down that says To, or T-O, and you can click on that drop-down, and you can select All if you want to send the note or the question to everyone or just to the presenters. Okay, and then you type in the box below that drop-down, that To drop-down, put in your question, and then hit Send. All right. Well, we have time for question and answers at the end, but if you really have a question you want to get out before that, feel free to send it, and it'll pop up in our screen, and we'll try and take the time to answer it as we go. Okay, so what are we covering today? Well, I'm Diane Cowin, the project manager from URS for this study, and I will cover the project status and detailed evaluation process. So really those first 3 bullets, if you will. And then Ian Bryant, the URS deputy project manager for this study, will cover the review of each of the corridor alternatives and the detailed analysis results of the work that we've been doing over the past several months. And then I will come back in the end to really discuss our public involvement and stakeholder involvement efforts that we've undertaken, as well as the next steps. We will then have, as I mentioned, some time for question and answers, and Brian Piasic from URS, as well as John Johnson, the Executive Director of ACOG, will be available to help answer any of your questions that you might have. So jumping right into it, what is the purpose of the study? Some of this might be a bit of a review for those of you who've joined us on other webinars or been to one of our other events. However, just to cover quickly, we were charged to really look and analyze transportation options in 3 corridors, the North Corridor, the East Corridor, and the South Corridor, that were identified in the region's 2005 Fixed Guideway Study. So the North Corridor is between Edmond and downtown Oklahoma City, as you can see here. And then the East Corridor is between Midwest City and Tinker Air Force Base into downtown. And then the South Corridor is from the Norman area up into Oklahoma City. And the whole goal is to be able to develop and generate what's called a locally preferred alternative for each corridor that would all connect into the downtown Santa Fe station in downtown Oklahoma City. So locally preferred alternative is just a jargon way of saying a preferred alignment for high-capacity transit and what type of mode, whether it be a form of rail or a form of bus. So the project sponsors for this are the Association of CentralOKgo Governments, which I'll refer to as AKOG, and then the cities in all of the corridors. So Del City, Edmond, Midwest City, Moore, Norman, and Oklahoma City. And URS Corporation is the consultant lead on this. Now the Regional Transit Dialogue was initiated by AKOG in cooperation with local partners in the spring of 2009, and it really focuses on engaging local elected officials, policy stakeholders, private sector leaders, and general public in a discussion about how transit can serve the central Oklahoma region in the future. This was basically an idea that came out of the Fixed Guideway study and is really, for this study, the CentralOKgo Commuter Corridor Study, really helped consider the public input we get from the work groups as well as public open houses and these webinars to really make final study recommendations and come up with what we're calling the locally preferred alternative in each one of those corridors, the north, the south, and the east. So what's the process? We've basically taken on a four-step process to get to locally preferred alternatives for each one of those corridors. We started back in late 2012, early 2013 with determining the goals and objectives for the studies. And we did this by working with the stakeholder and local work groups and the RTD to develop these goals and objectives that we then use to create evaluation criteria, which are used throughout steps 2 and 3. So for step 2, we basically worked with the work groups as well as the RTD to establish what are all the possible alignments or lines on the map to consider for transit in our region in these 3 corridors. Once we had all those possible alternatives, we used the criteria developed through the goals and objectives in step 1 to really refine those down to recommended alternatives that the work groups as well as the public and the RTD helped us move forward into step 3, which was the detailed evaluation of those alternatives. So that's where we are today. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to cover the detailed evaluation, and we'll also remind you of those recommended alternatives if you haven't seen them as of yet. And then finally, where we're headed is going towards that selecting the locally preferred alternative. And later in the webinar, I'll explain kind of our next steps to getting there. All right, so the approach to reaching a locally preferred alternative really contains 3 main elements that must be considered. Much like a stool with 3 legs, including detailed technical analysis, capital, and operation and maintenance costs. So capital being the cost to actually put the infrastructure in, and O&M being the ongoing costs to keep it running. As well as the third leg of the stool, which is the public and stakeholder sentiment. So it's really important today. Part of this webinar is really getting your input. So we're going to be asking that you fill out a survey at the end of this webinar. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. However, we do feel that this is really key to being able to help the RTD really understand the public sentiment. The webinar is the surveys from the webinar is a really good way to get that across. So back to reaching the locally preferred alternative. We say 3 legs of the stool because you can have the most feasible or technical evaluation, so that one leg of that stool can be really strong. It can be the best alternative for a particular corridor. However, it could cost 10 times as much. You could have the second most technically feasible alternative cost significantly less and be supported by the public. So therefore, you would probably go with the second most technically feasible. However, it makes the most sense from the public and financial side. So that's really where you have to do a bit of a balancing act between these different elements to actually achieve your locally preferred alternative. So the purpose of the detailed evaluation was really to evaluate those recommended alternatives that the RTD, the public, and the work groups helped us develop, and to identify the most technically viable alternative in each corridor. Again, this is just one leg of the stool. Again, as well, the evaluation criteria, as I mentioned before, for the detailed evaluation or technical evaluation was based on the RTD and work group identified goals and objectives. And you can see here the goals and objectives that the RTD and work group focused in on. Enhance regional mobility, support economic development and shape growth, provide a balanced and coordinated multimodal system. And then we added in technical feasibility at this stage of the game, since it was a detailed evaluation. We used this goals and objectives and the criteria developed from those to actually do the scoring and ranking. Now, Ian Bryant from URS will now cover the recommended alternatives for each corridor that were selected by the public's input, the work group analysis, and the RTD. And he will also cover the detailed analysis results for each of the alternatives in each corridor as well.
Thank you, Diane. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Bryant. I'm the Deputy Project Manager for our study. And as Diane mentioned, I'm going to go through the detailed analysis results in all three of the corridors, the north, south, and east, for the recommended alternatives. For those of you who have been following us or were on our previous webinar, we did start with 7 alignments in each corridor. And with your help and with the RTD and public and work group help, we narrowed that down to 3 alignments or alternatives in the east and the south and 4 in the north. And so we have the results of the detailed analysis on those particular alternatives for you today, and that's what I'm going to cover. We do have a lot to cover. As I said, I'm going through the detailed analysis for all 3 corridors. So I'm going to try to go through it fairly quickly. If you do have a question, I would appreciate if you could put it in the notes. Just go ahead and send it over to us. And then when we get through the PowerPoint, we can actually come back and address your particular comments. So we'll start with the North Corridor analysis. On your screen here on the right, you'll see a map that shows the North Corridor. And at the bottom is downtown Oklahoma City. At the top, you'll see City of Edmond. We have 4 alignments that we're looking at here. We have the light blue alignment we're calling N1. That's a commuter rail alignment. We have N2, which is the dark blue alignment to the left of the light blue one. That is, we're looking at light rail, streetcar, or bus rapid transit. We have the orange alignment, which is N3. For that, we're looking at light rail, streetcar, or bus rapid transit. And then on the right side of the map, you'll see that we have N7, which is kind of the reddish alignment. And for that, we're looking at streetcar and bus rapid transit. So for the first alignment, N1, the light blue one, you'll see that it actually uses the existing BNSF right-of-way. So that's the existing freight rail right-of-way that's out there today. That's the reason we're only looking at commuter rail in this alignment. For this alignment, we have 7 stations. All the stations you can see are the black dots along the alignments. For the commuter rail, we have a fewer number of stations than for the others. And the reason for this is really a commuter rail technology is designed to get people from the suburbs into downtown for work and back home as quickly as possible. So it's less about access to places along the way and more about getting you to work and back. It is within 100% dedicated right-of-way within that freight rail right-of-way. So what that means is it does not share the lanes with other traffic. So it's not going to be in a lane with other cars. It will be actually within its own right-of-way. So if there's an accident, it does not have to deal with any of that. It bypasses it. N2, again, is that dark blue line on the left. That goes up from downtown Oklahoma City up along Classen, around the curve, and gets then up onto the BNSF right-of-way. So it's sort of a hybrid. It uses Classen or an arterial roadway for a ways, and then it actually gets onto the BNSF right-of-way to continue on up into Edmond. And that one actually extends all the way into the UCO. For that one, we have 12 stations, and it is also within 100% dedicated right-of-way, so it's out of traffic. For that alternative, as I mentioned before, we're looking at light rail, streetcar, or bus rapid transit. For N3, which is that orange alignment, it actually shares the same alignment coming out of downtown, so with N2. So it actually goes up Classen as well, around the curve, and then up past Chesapeake, and gets onto the Broadway extension into downtown Edmond and UCO. And then finally, we have N7. That's the one, the red one on the east side. We're looking at streetcar and bus rapid transit. We have 11 stations proposed for that one. And that one uses all arterials. So it will actually go up past Health Sciences, the Capitol Complex, and then it'll go out east over to MLK and Eastern, and all the way up past the Adventure District into downtown Edmonds and onto UCO. For that one, it is actually not within dedicated right-of-way, so it will share lanes with other vehicles. Here's the results of our analysis for the North Corridor. To explain this to you, each bar represents a different alternative. So you'll see we have the N1 commuter rail on the left. If you go all the way to the right, you'll see the N7 streetcar. Looking at, for instance, the N1 on the left, you'll see we have obviously different colors on the stacked bar. Those colors, each color represents how that particular alternative scored for that particular goal. So for instance, on N1, that blue color that you see was the score that that alternative received for enhancing regional connectivity. So for that, we looked at things like how well did it connect to existing activity centers. The red color that you see is supporting economic development and shaping growth. So for that, we looked at things like population and employment densities, both current and projected, as well as looking at what kind of development momentum is there currently going on around these stations, and what kind of future development could we expect. The green that you see is providing a balanced and coordinated multimodal system. For that, we looked at things like ridership. We also looked at how well does it connect to other modes. So does it connect well to highways and roadways? Does it connect well to hike and bike trails? Does it have good pedestrian facilities around it? Things like that. And then finally, the purple that you see is technical feasibility. And for that, that's actually added since our last round of analysis, now that we have more detail and we have stations. For that, we looked at engineering constraints. So are there any complex engineering situations that we would have to deal with for this alternative? And we also looked at environmental and social impacts and benefits for each of these alternatives. To give you an example of kind of what we're looking at here in this scoring, I think the main thing that stands out is you'll see that the commuter rail does score the lowest, with the N2 alignment, the one that uses Classen as our highest ranking alternative. The commuter rail really scores lower because of two factors. That's how it scored on enhanced regional connectivity, and that's really both of these, the enhanced regional connectivity and the support economic development and shape growth, is where it doesn't score as well as the others. And both of those are due to the fact that it's on the existing freight right-of-way. For the enhanced regional connectivity, we're not hitting the activity centers as directly as we are with some of these other alternatives, so that's where it scores less there. And the freight corridor has a lot of industrial development surrounding it. And because of that, it means that kind of more in the short term, there's not a lot of existing development momentum around this alternative. It doesn't mean that in the future there's not a possibility for redevelopment. There definitely is. But compared to the other alternatives where you have some existing development momentum, you don't necessarily have it for N1. We also did ridership estimates, preliminary ridership estimates. One of our sub-consultants, Alliance Transportation Group, has been doing the transportation demand modeling for us. And so these are the initial ridership estimates that we received for the North Corridor. I think the main thing that jumps out here is that alternatives N1, N2, and N3 all have fairly healthy ridership. And then when you look at N7, obviously it's much lower. N7 didn't score as well on our initial round of analysis. We were asked to bring it forward as an eastern alignment to see how it performed, and we were expecting that it wouldn't perform as well. It does hit some major activity centers in the health sciences and the Capital Complex and the Adventure District, but then there's a large gap of no development for the most part between there and until you get into Edmond. So that would be the reason for the lower ridership there. We do, however, think that the ridership is probably underreported, not just in this corridor, but actually in all three of the corridors. And the reason for that is we're using data inputs that are for a region that doesn't have a lot of existing transit. And we also, for this modeling exercise, it does not include special events. So if you're going to a concert, if you're taking a train or a bus to the concert, or if you're going to a Thunder game, that's actually not represented in this number. So we expect that in reality there would be a bump for all of these alternatives. We did see for the North Corridor, we expected a lot of commuter activity, so we expected people to be going from the Edmond area, taking it into downtown for work. What we did find is that there's also a good number of intermediate trips, so people who are taking a train or the bus from Edmond down to, say, the Chesapeake area. We're seeing some of those trips as well. We don't think at this point in time that light rail as a mode really makes a lot of sense, not just for this corridor, but for really any of the corridors. And the reason we say that is we're just not seeing the ridership that you would need in order to support a light rail technology. If we would need about 3 times the ridership numbers that you see here before we really approached a number where it would start to make sense. We do, however, think that there's a potential to capture some of the light rail ridership through a potential streetcar extension. The first phase of the streetcar in Oklahoma City is currently under design, and it extends on the northern end up to Northwest 10th Street. And we do think that you could probably extend that on up Classen a ways, and through that capture some of that light rail ridership. As you can see, N2 and N3 in the table above have higher ridership than N1. And we think a lot of that is due to that segment between kind of the Northwest 10th along Classen all the way up to around the Northwest 63rd or Chesapeake area. So there's a potential to capture that ridership with a streetcar extension. We do have what we're calling a sensitivity analysis upcoming. What that is we've had a chance to pour through our data that we have so far. We've reached out to the public. We've worked with the work groups. And this gives us an opportunity to go back and really try to optimize the system, make tweaks to some of the alignments, and rerun some numbers and see what we come up with. So that'll be coming up here very shortly. And I should mention that we are assuming in most cases what we're calling a gold standard of investment. In this corridor, N7 is not a gold standard, but the others are. And what I mean by that is gold standard generally means that you're talking about an alternative within its own right-of-way, so it's out of traffic. Usually these also have nicer amenities associated with them. So we will be when we get to the capital and O&M cost specs on the next slide, you'll see this gold standard reflected in the numbers that you see here. So here are the capital and O&M costs for the North Corridor. The capital costs, what that means, I think Diane mentioned it earlier, but the capital costs are really your upfront investment for the infrastructure to build these projects. So it's kind of a one-time cost. You build them, and then you have your O&M costs or your operations and maintenance costs, and that's what it costs yearly to operate and maintain these investments. You'll see on the capital costs that we have a range. The reason for that is these are really rough order of magnitude costs. So these are real high. These are higher level. We're still at the planning stage as as RTD selects an LPA and we move on into more of the design or engineering. At that point, then you really start to hone in on a particular cost. But for now, we really have to give more of a range because there's still quite a few details to work out. The capital costs were developed using what we call a cost per mile approach. So we looked at costs for these types of projects all around the United States, kind of come up with an average cost that makes sense. And then we also apply a factor of either urban, suburban, or rural. And what that means is for that per mile cost in an urban area, we're talking about a higher density. There's just more development that we have to deal with. So the cost to implement one of these projects is generally higher in an urban setting. Whereas when you get more to a suburban area, the cost is a little bit lower. So that factor is applied to the cost per mile as well to come up with an ultimate range of capital costs for these projects. You will see that we have annualized capital costs and annualized O&M costs as well. And basically, the annualized just means that it's allowing us to, there are different what we call life cycles for these, for not only the vehicles, but also for the infrastructure. And so for rail, it tends to be longer, and for bus, it's shorter. And so we're trying to just be able to compare more apples to apples. By doing an annualized, you kind of factor that into it, and so it gives us an ability to really compare apples to apples, as I mentioned. The service or the operating characteristics that you'll see under the assumptions, those are all, that's for all of these alternatives. So for each one of them, all of those apply to it. And it actually applies to all of the alternatives in all three of the corridors. And then this shows you really just kind of a side-by-side comparison. This shows you two legs of the stool, as Diane mentioned. What we're seeing here on the left are the detailed evaluation results for the North Corridor that I showed you earlier. And then on the right is the costs. That's showing you a graph of the costs. So on the left, obviously, the higher the bar, the better score. And on the right, the higher the bar, the higher the costs. So what this really allows you to do is, like I said, look at two legs of the stool together and see, for instance, the N2 with light rail that you see there scored extremely well on the left. But then when you look on the right, the N2 light rail is also our most expensive out of all of the alternatives. So you really have to, as Diane mentioned, it's weighing everything. You can't just go with whatever scores highest. You also have to consider cost. You also obviously have to consider what the public wants. On N1, you'll see there that that obviously doesn't score as well. I mentioned earlier, it has a lot to do with the enhancing regional connectivity and the economic development. However, it's also much more technically feasible because it's within the existing BNSF right-of-way. There's a lot fewer social and environmental impacts, and there's also a lot fewer engineering constraints. And then when you look at the costs, even though it didn't score as well as some of the others, the cost is lower than all of the other rail options. It's actually lower than some of the BRT options as well, with only N7 scoring less. So really, it's a like I said, you have to really weigh everything together. So for the North Corridor, some of our kind of general team observations, we definitely think that high-capacity transit makes sense within this corridor, also within the region as a whole. As I mentioned, we don't think that light rail makes sense at this point in time. We think that when we look at the model results, we see that we see those long-haul trips of people commuting, going from Edmond into downtown Oklahoma City for sure. We see a lot of that. But as I mentioned, we also see some of these more intermediate trips, people stopping along the way as well. The pass-through trips, or the people who are traveling, say, from Edmond down to Moore, we don't see, those are pretty low. So really we're seeing, people really tend to stay within this corridor. For the North Corridor, we do see that there's a pretty good engineering challenge, and that's trying to navigate across I-44. The commuter rail obviously has an existing right-of-way across 44 currently. So that's kind of unique for the commuter rail and gives it kind of a bump when it comes to looking at engineering challenges, whereas the others we would still have to determine the best way across. And as I also mentioned, there is the potential to extend streetcar north to kind of that northwest 63rd area in order to gain some of that ridership benefit from what you saw for N2 without the full cost, which N2 is very expensive, without that full cost of building N2. So that's something to keep in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the south. The south corridor, here are our recommended alternatives. These are all the ones that we reviewed in the detailed analysis. You'll see that there's three alignments that we looked at. There's the light blue, the dark blue, and the orange. The light blue is what we're calling S1, and that's where we're looking at commuter rail in that corridor. This would basically be where this is the BNSF line, the freight right-of-way extending south out of downtown Oklahoma City through Moore and Norman. So we would be utilizing the freight right-of-way in this corridor as well with that S1 alternative. For that, we have 9 stations. It's fewer than the other alternatives, and again, that's just because we're trying to get people into downtown and back quickly for work. It is 100% dedicated right-of-way, so it's out of traffic. If there's an accident on the highway, we bypass it and we don't have to deal with it. With S2, we're looking at the orange alignment there. It comes out of downtown along Shields. It actually crosses I-35 and then gets onto the BNSF right-of-way. So it's a hybrid. We're basically using arterial up north and then using the BNSF right-of-way in the south. It would continue down through Moore, through Norman to OU, with all of these alternatives actually ending at State Highway 9, which would be a good park and ride location. For S2, we're looking at streetcar or bus rapid transit. We're proposing 11 stations, and it would also be in 100% dedicated right-of-way, so you wouldn't have to deal with traffic. S4 is the dark blue line that you see. It also comes out of downtown Oklahoma City along Shields, and then it gets onto I-35, goes down Flood, and then across Robinson to Porter, and down Porter down into downtown Norman, and through OU to State Highway 9. There's 12 stations proposed for that one, and it is also with 100% dedicated right-of-way. So here's the results for the South Corridor. I think the main takeaway on this slide is that all of these are good alternatives. You know, they all seem very viable. All of the ones we looked at could be very good projects from a technical standpoint. You know, the commuter rail did score a little bit lower than the others, but these are all within, you know, less than 10 points of each other. So really now then, okay, from a technical standpoint, it scores really well. We need to look at some of the other factors and see how they add up. So here's the ridership estimates for the South Corridor. Again, you know, for all of these, we have pretty healthy ridership, and they're all within a similar range of each other. So we don't really have that drop-off, you know, that we saw in the north with one of the alternatives. These are all, again, from a ridership standpoint, very viable projects. So again, then we have to look further, and really the next thing to look at is what about cost? So when we go and we start looking at costs, as you'll see here, you know, when we look at OEM costs, it's all fairly the same. We're talking about $3.5 to around $5, a little over $5 million per year. But when you start looking at the capital costs, you can see some big differences here. The commuter rail, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide that shows a side-by-side comparison here. So you can really see when you look at these side-by-side with the valuation results on the left and the costs on the right, that even though they're all scoring very well on the left, there are some major differences in costs. So with commuter rail, even though it's a lower scoring slightly, it's a lot cheaper than some of these others. So really that starts to point us towards the commuter rail direction. So some of our general observations for the South Corridor. As with the North Corridor, we definitely think that high-capacity transit makes sense in the South Corridor. We do see, as with the North, we see some of those intermediate trips. So the South Corridor is actually our longest corridor. It's, I guess, it's right around 20 miles. And with that, you generally see is that, you know, that's a better commuter corridor. You have a longer distance, you know, you have an option to really, or an ability to really serve commuters well with transit. But with the North Corridor, as with the North Corridor, we still see these intermediate trips as well. So we have people, in fact, when I was looking at the ridership yesterday, we have a good number of people kind of doing that, what you would consider a reverse commute. You know, we have a lot of people getting into downtown, obviously, from Norman and Moore. But we have quite a few people who are also live in Moore and are taking the train or the bus south to OU. So, you know, obviously having OU is a very unique thing to the South Corridor. It's a very large university, and so it has a big draw. It's almost like having a second downtown. So it really has a big draw as well, and we see a lot of ridership that direction as well. So we see those more intermediate trips happening as well. And again, the pass-through trips, people going from, say, Moore up to Edmond or Norman to Chesapeake, they're a little bit lower. For the South Corridor, there is an engineering constraint with some of the alternatives, especially with the S2 alternative, that hybrid that uses Shields and then the BNSF right-of-way. it has to cross over I-35. There's not an existing crossover there, so you would have to construct something across it, some sort of structure, which obviously that gets pretty complex from an engineering standpoint. So to keep that in mind. And then with alternative S4, which is the one that uses all arterials and I-35, goes across Robinson and down Porter. Obviously, we're getting into, for all three of these in the South Corridor, we're assuming 100% dedicated right-of-way. But with alternative S4, really as you get downtown into Norman, down into the OU area, you're talking about a lot more constrained right-of-way, so you're probably looking at scaling back some of the dedicated right-of-way there. So you probably would, in reality, have some areas of mixed flow where you're in travel lanes with other vehicles. With that, I'm going to move us into the East Corridor. These are the recommended alternatives that we have in the East. We have three alternatives, or three alignments that we're looking at with a number of modes considered for some of them. E1, or the light blue alignment that you see, we're looking at commuter rail there. The alignment actually uses, get my pointer out here. The alignment actually uses existing UP right-of-way. This is UP current. They have freight traffic on it currently. And then when you get here to this point, starting from that point down southeast is an abandoned rail right-of-way. So it's a right-of-way that currently exists that doesn't have anything using it right now. So it's a very unique aspect of the East Corridor, and it's something that we really hope to capture and use. For the E1, we're proposing 6 stations, and it would be within 100% dedicated right-of-way. E5 is your orange alignment. You'll see it coming out of downtown, going up 8th and 10th through the health sciences, and then it crosses over the river and onto the abandoned right-of-way as well. And all of these pass through Midwest City down and ends at Tinker Air Force Base. For that, we propose 7 stations, and it's 50% dedicated right-of-way. So that first portion up along 8th and 10th would be with mixed flow, so we'd be with traffic. You would be traveling in a lane with other vehicles. And then as it crosses the river and gets onto the abandoned right-of-way, that would be dedicated right-of-way, so it would be completely out of traffic. And then E6, which is your dark blue, also goes up 8th and 10th through health sciences. And then it actually continues along 10th over to Air Depot, has multiple stops down Air Depot, and then across Southeast 29th, ending right in front of Tinker Air Force Base. For that one, we have no dedicated right-of-way, so it's mixed flow, and we're with other traffic for that alternative. Here are the results for the East Corridor. You can see some pretty good variation here. The commuter rail did score the lowest, and as with the other corridors, it's actually a little amplified in this case, in this corridor. There is a lot of existing industrial development around the UP line coming out of downtown Oklahoma City. And again, when you start to look at economic development, that's difficult to, there's not a lot of development momentum, and in the long run you could redevelop it, but in the shorter term, there's obviously, it's definitely a hurdle. So it scores lower there because of that. And it doesn't, these other ones, the other alternatives really connect the activity centers better than the E1 commuter rail alignment. So, you can really see that there is some variation here. E6 did score the highest. Both, I guess, the streetcar scored a little higher than the bus rapid transit. But really, we know when you start looking at, okay, well, what about ridership? Let's check out ridership. And then you see some big differences. Obviously, the big thing you see here is that E1 has some decent ridership, especially compared to E5 and E6. Those are both very low. What we found here in the East Corridor is that the East Corridor is really the only corridor of the three that truly functions as a commuter corridor. So people really are just trying to get from their homes to work. So when we provided, with E5 and E6, where we connected a lot of these activity centers along the way, what we found when we modeled it was that the travel times were too long. And really, when you had a quicker travel time, which was that E1 alignment, we had much healthier ridership. So we're going to get into it in a minute, but we did, because of this, kind of create an option on one of these alternatives on the E1. And like I said, we'll get into that. But that will be part of our sensitivity analysis that's upcoming. So here are the capital and O&M costs for these alternatives. As you can see on the capital cost side, the E6 BRT is substantially less expensive. But then again, we have very low ridership with it. With the commuter rail, it is cheaper than all of the other rail options, and it's fairly comparable in capital costs to the E5 BRT as well. So let's look at the side-by-side comparison here. And when you do that, I think the thing that really jumped out at me when I first saw this was, looking at just these two pieces, it really draws you to E6. It's our second highest scoring on the left, and it's by far our cheapest alternative. But then when you look at the ridership, it's just not there. And so because of that, it's, thinking of travel time, the travel time issue here in the east, we thought, we really need to think about another potential tweak to one of these alternatives. So we're looking at what we're calling an E1 option on Reno. So basically, following that, it would still use the abandoned right-of-way down through Midwest City to Tinker, and it would actually use Reno then instead of the UP right-of-way. As I mentioned, the UP right-of-way for the commuter rail does have that engineering constraint of trying to get downtown. Basically, as you get into downtown Oklahoma City and you're trying to connect into the Santa Fe station, you have that tie-in there is really complex from an engineering standpoint. So a lot of the costs associated with, or a good chunk of the costs associated with, capital costs associated with that E1 alignment is due to that engineering constraint. So with all of those things, considering all of those things, we thought, well, maybe we need to look at an option that goes down Reno as well. So for the sensitivity analysis, we're going to be looking at a 100% dedicated right-of-way alternative that could be either bus rapid transit or commuter rail that would travel down Reno out of Oklahoma City and then onto the abandoned right-of-way down through Midwest City and onto Tinker. But I think one of the main points here in the East Corridor is that we have a really good opportunity to use that abandoned rail right-of-way, and so we're really pushing that whatever comes out of this, that abandoned rail right-of-way really does need to be used. It's a feature that we don't have in the other corridors that's very unique. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Diane. She's going to step you through the next steps in the study.
Thank you, Ian. So now that Ian's gone through our detailed technical analysis and the cost estimates as well as the ridership information, that's really, again, two of the legs of that stool. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the third leg of that stool, the public and stakeholder sentiment. Ian, presenting rights, please. Thank you. Okay, so here's our public and stakeholder outreach program that we've done for this project since the beginning. In addition to this list, we also obviously have the RTD meetings that have been happening approximately every couple of months, depending on the level of activity during the study. So we basically, the first grouping, the commuter and stakeholder work groups, these were made up of local officials, business and community leaders for each one of the corridors, and they really did, we had 3 separate work groups and they really focused in on each corridor. So with that, what we did on the first round here in July of 2013, again, we had them work on developing the goals and objectives, which we then created criteria. In round 2, we went through alignments with them. They helped us come up with the recommended alternatives to move forward, and then in round 3, they gave us their locally preferred alternatives for each of their corridors. We then also incorporated a wider net of public open house approach to reach the general public. And in round one, we had a first open house in November of 2013. We got decent turnout, but not as good as we had hoped. So in round two, we changed things up a bit, and we have been doing road shows, which we're about to be finishing up, and I'll speak on those a little bit more on the next slide. We also had newsletters to kind of keep people informed of the study and where we are in the process. We'll have one more in summer of 2014. And then obviously we've been doing the webinars. We did one back in January, and this is our second webinar here in May. Okay, so for the public outreach roadshows, as I mentioned before, we've had we're having roadshows in 9 different locations. That's 3 in the South Corridor, 3 in the North Corridor. In the end, we'll have 3 in the East Corridor and 1 in Oklahoma City, trying to really get a good cross-section of the community. At these roadshows, we ask people to fill out the surveys. We give them information about the project, talk through the project with them, and then ask them to fill out surveys for us. Through this, we've been able to actually receive over 130 surveys so far, and we have one more upcoming roadshow in Midwest City at the Made in Oklahoma Wine, Beer, and Food Festival, which I'm sure will be a great event to attend. So now that we have completed the detailed analysis, the cost estimates, and the ridership, and we're really close to getting our public and stakeholder sentiment completed through our work groups, as well as this webinar and our road shows, including the one we have coming up on Saturday, we can provide all of this information, or all the 3 legs of the stool, to the RTD for their work session, which is set up for May 30th. Now this is going to be a roll-up-the-sleeves work session for them. They're really going to have to dig deep into the data and the information we provide to them, and start to determine and formulate their preliminary locally preferred alternatives for each one of these corridors, if at all possible. It's a lot to get done in one work session, but we're hoping we can help them get there. And then they hope to formalize those locally preferred alternatives for each corridor on June 25th. So again, I can't stress enough the importance of your input. You've taken the time out of your busy schedules, I know, to attend this webinar, so it would really help us out if you can take a few more minutes after the webinar to fill out the survey. We will have sent you an email at this point. I noticed that I have an email already in mind to fill out my survey. And so you'll see the email from all the registered participants today. We'll have that, and it'll have a link to our survey that you can fill out. And you can give your thoughts on each one of the corridors, the north, the south, and the east. And by all means, tell your friends, see if they can't go to the Beer and Wine Festival and Food Festival in Midwest City and fill out surveys there as well in person if they'd rather. All right, and with that, I'll now open the floor for questions. Again, use the Notes tab on the right-hand side. Select All for recipients, or you can just send it to the presenters if you like, and then type your question and click Submit, I believe it is. I have a lot of notes flying in here, so Peter gave us a smiley face. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate that. We're pretty excited as well. Let's see. We've also got a question here, Ian. I don't know if you can see Peter's other question he's got regarding the South.
Yes. Yeah, we can go through each of these here. Let me go ahead and read them just so everybody has them here. I'll start with what I think was your first question, Peter. You have you say for the north and south corridors, is commuter rail modeled with 30-minute off-peak, 50-minute peak headways, because that's a very frequent commuter rail service. And the answer is yes. For modeling purposes, we did model it with 30-minute off-peak and 15-minute peak. The reason for that is we really didn't want to penalize it against the other alternatives. We really wanted to see, what kind of ridership could we get with some really good service here. I don't know, Brian, if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Well, I mean, I've always been accused of getting too far down in the weeds, but the biggest issue for commuter rail is that when you model, I mean, the model doesn't really care about mode, but one of the things in the model that can retard ridership is the waiting time between trains. And the way commuter rail works typically is people will drive to a station and get there right before the train is scheduled to leave and hop on the train and go. So in order to essentially trick the model from not putting the exorbitant wait times for 30-minute service, we gave it 15-minute service. So we think that we can obtain that ridership or even more with 30-minute service or something maybe a little less, a little more frequent than that, and still obtain the same amount of ridership.
Thank you. So that was one of Peter's questions. The other one he had was that some of the dark blue line, so this is for north, some of the dark blue line is the former Oklahoma RY interurban right-of-way. Is that actually intact, or will land need to be acquired?
That is actually intact. There's a large median. Well, most of it. I should say most of it. There's a large median as you go north, kind of through the Chesapeake campus, where it used to run, and that median is still there. It's still vacant basically. And then I guess as you get close and you try to tie it back in, that goes north for quite a ways where it's still intact. As you would get closer to trying to tie in to the, if you did do the arterial option and try to tie into Broadway Extension, then yes, you would have to acquire additional right-of-way. And when I say intact, obviously the rail's not still there, but there is a wide median there where we can accommodate it.
Great, thanks, Ian. And Peter did correct me. Thank you. That was railway, not RY, interurban right-of-way. It was railway. Thank you, Peter. It's always fun trying to figure out how people do acronyms here. So let's see. We got the 30-minute off-peak one done. On the south, I believe it is, I would expect students, faculty, staff near the line would want to take the train to campus, but what does the data say?
And that's actually what I was looking at yesterday. I was looking at the results for that S1 in the south. And the thing that shocked me the most is the number of people getting off, at least according to the model, getting off at that Brooks station is higher than the number of people getting off at the downtown station. So they're very close. There's a lot of people. Those are by far our top two stations that people are accessing on this route. But it's extremely healthy.
Good. Okay. So go ahead.
I would just add to that our model does not take into consideration special events either. So there would be a lot of potential for football games and basketball games and the like for people using this facility to get into Norman. Good
point. I think one of the other things that's important, I see Rob Kochman says, that in the models, certain options might win out in the short term, but as the system grows, an upgrade might be necessary. In the studies, is this a factor? So an upgrade won't be a full destruction of capital, effectively blocking such an upgrade. So in other words, are we building in some capacity for growth assuming that this is going to be a very successful system, right? So I don't know, Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
The question is absolutely, these ridership numbers could be accommodated with, essentially one-car trains. So there would be a lot of inherent capacity in the system with very little capital cost just by adding cars to the trains.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So we've had another question I saw from Peter Laws is that for the south, the BRT line in Norman along Porter, dedicated right-of-way? Question. Not sure there is room to do that in both directions, but like some of the north alignments, you could run BRT/LRT down the old interurban right-of-way from Flood. The foundations for a road bridge were included in the Robinson Underpass and then down front/James Garner through the heart of downtown to Jenkins and right into campus. Whether that's a good idea or not, I don't know, but it would seem that it would be easier to run rapid transit along that alignment than Porter and Classen in Norman.
Yeah, I guess looking at the flood option, I mean, I agree with the along Porter. You know, dedicated right-of-way is difficult through there, and I think when I mentioned that slide that I mentioned we would probably not have dedicated right-of-way in some of those areas as you get right into the heart of town. And you know, I would have to go out there and I guess look at it, but I think really on a lot of these arterial options, you probably would have areas where you couldn't, not that you couldn't, but that it might not be popular to have you know, completely dedicated right-of-way right through town. But again, I guess I'm not as familiar with that area through flood, so I would have to take a look at it. But I would also say that I think that's another reason the commuter rail really scored well or did well in this corridor when you take all the factors into consideration. As you know, it really goes right through the heart of Norman and OU, and we don't even have to worry about, you know, acquiring right-of-way. We can just use that existing BNSF right-of-way. Of course, that means we have to have successful negotiations with BNSF, but you know, they've worked with cities around the country on this, and so I think it's definitely a good possibility. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I think you covered it well. Peter wants to know when he can buy a ticket.
Well, we need to raise a few $1 million, so if you could work on that first.
All right, great. Any other questions coming in?
Diane, while we're waiting for questions, I think one thing that we need to mention for everyone on the call is that all of these alternatives have been modeled with some very significant increases in the bus network. You know, that we realized going into this that there would be, you know, a real need for collection and distribution of passengers along these corridors. So we made sure that we put provisions in the model for significant increases in local bus. And just so everybody knows, that the ridership numbers today are in the 9,000 to 10,000 range total for the system in Oklahoma City, Norman, and Edmond. And the bus network plus these rail lines bumps up to 32,000 a day. So, you know, we're getting a lot more people transported on transit than just these individual lines.
I'm not seeing any more questions coming in at this time. If you're typing, go ahead and start submitting so we can hitting send so we can make sure and get them before we sign off. We're about a minute over our time, and I want to be very respectful of everyone's time here during their lunch hour. No? All right. If Ian or Brian or John Johnson, if you have anything to finalize with?
I don't.
All right. Again, I just want to thank everyone for spending the time with us. Really appreciate it. Hope you all can, you know, fill out your surveys and maybe even make it to that the Wine, Beer, and Food Festival in Midwest City. I think it'll be a great event, and of course it's even greater if you can fill out a survey for us at it. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and keep in touch with CentralOKgo on our website at CentralOKgo.org. Thank you.